Hello, my name is Chris Snipes, and you are listening to The Melt. Scientific materialism is literally a cage. It tethers one to a world that is limited by matter and only gives credence to what can be weighed, measured, seen, and touched. It can only be apprehended by the senses and is therefore limited to what our meat brains and our meat suits can grasp. But at an ever-increasing pace, materialism is becoming outmoded. As science begins to look beyond matter, it is realizing that we are much more than our physical selves. Not only that, we are just beginning to see just how vast and expansive what we call reality actually is. This is something that Eastern philosophy and psychonauts have known for a long time, so in essence, things are coming full circle. Today's guest, Christopher Bache, definitely exemplifies the psychonautical category. Over a period of 20 years, he underwent 73 very intense LSD trips in order to systematically explore his own mind and the mind of the universe, and they forever changed him. What he discovered and recounts in his book, LSD and the Mind of the Universe, is that what we know as the physical universe is nestled within a much, much more expansive and perhaps limitless spiritual universe. I begin the conversation by asking Chris what first implored him to start experimenting with LSD.
Well, I was fresh out of graduate school. I got out of graduate school from Brown. I did my degree in philosophy of religion. I basically had finished my dissertation and was shipping a couple of essays out of my dissertation and was looking for where to take my work next. And I found the work of Stanislav Grof. I found his first book, Realms of the Human Unconscious. Now, this is a long time ago. This is 1978. And he had just published Realms of the Human Unconscious, and I read that book, and I immediately knew that this research with psychedelics was going to be pivotal, not only for psychology, but also for philosophy. And I had been trained as a philosopher of religion. So I knew that the people who would be doing the most important work in the near future would be people writing out of an experiential, not simply a theoretical framework. But to do that, you had to basically cultivate the experiences. And I knew it wasn't a matter of cultivating simply a few experiences, but of undertaking a long systematic regimen. So that's what I did. I basically divided my life in half. During my daytime job, I was a university professor and doing the things professors do. But I began, in my private life, I stepped behind a wall of secrecy, and I began to work systematically with LSD following Stan Grof's protocols. And I did 73 high-dose LSD sessions over 20 years.
And did you have any previous experience with psychedelics?
No. I was a completely naive psychedelicist. I mean, I'd smoked some grass in graduate school, but I was really completely a novice at psychedelics. I just was convinced that this was important, so I wanted to do it. So I always worked according to the strict protocols. I always had a sitter. All my work, I was working in isolation. I was protected. I was lying down on a mattress on the floor. I was surrounded by pillows. I had eye shades on, very carefully curated playlist. My wife was actually my sitter for all these sessions. She's a clinical psychologist, and so she learned LSD psychotherapy with me by studying the literature as it came out. And of course, Stan published his book, LSD Psychotherapy, in 1980. And I started my work in 1979. So I did this work between 1979 and 1999, between when I was 30 and 50 years old. And then I spent a long time processing these experiences. I had to wait until I retired from the university before I could speak about them publicly. And I also these experiences went so deep that even though I understood them while I was doing them, I knew that there was more to unpack, and it took years to really unpack them sufficiently until I felt I understood them to be able to write about them as a whole.
I bet. Yeah. I was really astounded by how much you were able to bring back from those experiences, because those are so otherworldly. It's hard to translate that into English, you know.
It is. That took a lot of time and effort to do that, and I had to develop some tricks of the trade. First, I always recorded my sessions within 24 hours of the session. And secondly, I developed a technique for getting a comprehensive description, a phenomenologically accurate description. The day after a session, particularly a high-dose session, you're still porous around the edges. But what I would do is, in that porous condition, when I was writing up the session, I would listen to the music that was played inside the session in exactly the same order in which it was played. And I'd play the music one piece over and over again until I felt like I had captured what had happened in that part of the music. And then I'd go on to the next part of the music. So I would spend the whole day essentially really writing up as complete and accurate account as I could. And basically, I think I learned how to be a writer, writing my sessions, because I was always writing at the edges of my understanding. And I had to learn how to trust that process. And I learned that what was unclear in one session would become clear in the next session. Because my experience was that if you standardize these variables as much as possible, and if you create a condition for clean contact, then when you go back to these states of consciousness, you're not always starting from scratch. You basically begin more or less where you stopped. And so there's a deepening spiral of initiation that takes place. And so your recall gets better. Your capacity to remember these non-ordinary states gets better if you approach it in a very disciplined and trained manner. I mean, I've never tripped. I've never gone to concerts, dropped acid and talked with friends and went to a concert. I always did this work in a very careful, conscientious manner.
Mm-hmm. You said high dosages. What were the dosages?
Well, after 3 initial sessions at about 250 micrograms, I worked at 500 to 600 micrograms, which is a very high dose. It's in the psychedelic therapy range. This is not a protocol I would recommend today. I mean, I learned a lot in this process, but one of the things I learned is that this is not a protocol that I would recommend. If I were doing it over again, I would be gentler with myself. I'd take a slower approach in. But I chose to work with very powerful doses. I was very interested in seeing how far they could take me.
Sure.
And so that's what I did.
And you maintained that dosage through all 73 sessions?
All consistent, yeah. Basically,
Wow.
after the first 3 medium dose, there were 70 high doses all the way through.
Wow. That's amazing in and of itself, and there should be some sort of a Psychonautical Award for that. you need a medal.
yeah, the stupid award.
Well, I mean, you said it was tough. Obviously, you had to go through a lot during these sessions, and we'll get more into that. But I mean, you came out the other end glad that you did it, right?
Oh, very much so. Yeah. These days were I consider them, next to the birth of my children, the most important days of my life in this incarnation. These days cumulatively became my deepest experience of what it is, of the intelligence that lies behind the fabric of the universe. So you can call it the divine, you can call it God, you can call it, the consciousness of the cosmos. You can call it the Tao. this thing, we're dealing with a consciousness which is so vast, so profound, that it shatters all of our limitations, all of our capacities. We really are like ants trying to understand, the dynamics of the earth, except we're engaging truly the consciousness of the universe itself.
And speaking of consciousness, you categorize it into three different sections: psychic, subtle, and causal. Can you describe what you mean by this?
Well, I use those terms because Stan had used those terms, and he had gotten them from Ken Wilber. And Ken Wilber's typology of the stages of spiritual development are psychic, subtle, causal, and non-dual. Stan uses them differently as a phenomenological description of the states of consciousness that emerge. It would take us a while to explain these in detail. I have a section in the first chapter, the methodology chapter, where I explain what they mean for me. Basically, what you're seeing are stages of initiation into transpersonal states of consciousness in which the conditioning of time and space are gradually falling away. So your early entry into transpersonal reality, there's still your consciousness is still highly conditioned by assumptions that you carry into that from your time-space experience. But as you go deeper into those states and as you are changed by those encounters, that conditioning tends to fall away, and then you begin to enter into deeper levels of consciousness. So at the psychic level of consciousness, you may be having many experiences of your spiritual self, your soul, so to speak, your disincarnate sense of self. There is a sense of it's kind of atomistic. You're in a world that's spiritual, it's non-physical, but it's kind of broken up in lots of small pieces. As you go into the subtle level of consciousness, you begin to deal with the deeper architecture of reality, the collective unconscious of your species, the collective mind of different species. You go deeper, you're going into archetypal reality, the fundamental forces that are actually the structuring influences of physical reality. When you go into causal reality, you're dealing, the world begins to stop functioning in its pieces, and you begin to move into experiences where you experience the world moving as a single, unified reality. And there are, of course, many layers of depth into experiencing the world, moving as a fundamental oneness. It's the theme of that reality is oneness. Yeah.
And you describe the physical universe as being nestled inside of the spiritual universe.
Yeah, I think of the physical universe as the daughter universe and the spiritual universe as the mother universe. Mm-hmm. The physical universe emerged out of the Big Bang, out of the mother universe, and of course it constantly is nourished by a flow-through of energy that's coming from the mother universe. I mean, we know this is what quantum physics is telling us, that physical reality is constantly sustained by a flow of energy that comes in at the unified field level, at the quantum field level. So I think of the physical universe as gestating within the womb of the spiritual universe, and that human experience, human life, by the time we evolve to our level of development, we're moving back and forth systematically between the physical world and the spiritual world. I mean, my first book was on reincarnation. So I think reincarnation now has been demonstrated to be simply a fact of life. I think Ian Stevenson's work at the University of Virginia, all the work of different psychotherapists working in past life therapy, have given us ample evidence to understand that our minds are larger and older than our bodies, that we have history, and we're going back and forth between physical reality, spiritual reality, back to physical reality, back into spiritual reality. So my understanding is we go from the ego, our time-space consciousness, into the soul, the consciousness that holds all of our experience, back into individual consciousness, back into the soul, back and forth. And in this process, we basically are accumulating more and more learning, more and more understanding, more in development. We activate potentials which are latent within the human system. The ancient Hindus thought of these as the chakras, the 7 chakras. Different systems count these energy systems in different ways, but we're basically activating higher and higher levels of consciousness as we mature psychospiritually.
Well, in the Tibetan Buddhists, they say after death you spend 49 days in the bardo and then you come back, you incarnate again. Do you think that's the way that it is all the time, or do you think that some people hang out in the spiritual for several lifetimes and then come back into the dense physical?
I think any system which is using numbers, and I have tremendous respect for the Vajrayana system. I mean, I practice within Vajrayana Buddhism myself, but I don't think it's as simple as 49 days. I mean, those numbers tend to be highly symbolic and ritualized. The evidence from past life therapists is that the range of the time range that we spend in spiritual reality varies enormously from anywhere from a few months to up to 1,000 years. So there's enormous variety in how fast people are coming back and how much time they spend in the spiritual world. But the basic principle is the same. We leave here, we debrief, we process our learning experience from this world, we go through a series of experiences, we rest, we recuperate, we study and learn in the spiritual world. And here I think Michael Newton's work in Journey of Souls and Destiny of Souls is excellent, excellent work. He's a past life therapist who discovered accidentally that he could regress his people beyond where they died in their previous lives into the interlife state. And so he was able to give us a pretty good description of a lot of what happens in the bardo, and it concurs completely with what the Tibetans are saying and what the Egyptian Book of the Dead has, except it's more detailed and it's clinically focused rather than theologically focused.
Do you think that there is a point where we sort of, for lack of a better term, graduate from the physical and then just exist forevermore in the spiritual or less dense planes?
Yeah. Well, this brings us to a broader point. I think a lot of the religious traditions, they caught the fact of reincarnation, they understood reincarnation, but that doesn't mean that they understood it well enough to really understood what the deep purpose of reincarnation is in the deeper order of the universe. All of the religions that were born in the axial age are all up and out cosmologies. So the basic idea is that you achieve some state of enlightenment, moksha, which means escape, realization, salvation, and then you experience, this takes you into an off-planet spiritual condition. So the goal is you achieve a realization and the fruition comes in the spiritual world. So the basic movement is always to experience realization and to leave, to get up and to leave. And I think that reflects our condition about 4,000 years ago when we began to have sustained experiential contact with the Mother Universe through yoga, through meditation, through psychedelics. And when you experience the Mother Universe, it's such an ecstatic reality. I mean, it's such a profoundly satisfying experience that immediately you know that, in a sense, we belong there more than here. That's our home. So we develop theologies of what you might think of as theologies of the fall. We don't belong here. We fell out of paradise. We're bumped out. And so the theologies are then the theologies of return. You achieve moksha, you return. Now that we're beginning to understand more about the universe, we're beginning to see how big it is and how old it is and how many billions and billions of years have gone into it. What those theologies leave out is what is the function of time and space? What is the purpose of the physical universe? They have no satisfactory explanation. And I think now what we're beginning to understand is that in this transition back and forth between time and space and the Mother Universe, we are maturing and we are integrating more and more spiritual capacity within the physical form. And eventually we do want to awaken. We do want to kind of give birth to a higher consciousness within this physical body. But once we do that, I don't think the purpose of existence is then to awaken and leave. I think the purpose is to awaken and then to participate consciously, fully consciously, in the evolutionary process, in the evolving process. Now, I think we do achieve levels of awareness in which we come to points in our development where we can leave if we want to. But I think the trajectory of evolution is not simply to up and out. The trajectory is to mature and mature and mature, and to achieve, basically to achieve heaven on earth, to truly achieve full heavenly realization, total satisfaction, radical communion with the divine, inside time and space, not only as individuals, but as an entire species. I think that's where we're going, the entire species going through the transition that has classically been known as spiritual awakening. I call this the birth of the diamond soul. The birth of the diamond soul inside time and space.
Why do you think that it's important that occurs within time and space?
Well, first, this is just what has been shown me. This is where my sessions, basically in all the years I was doing this work, I was being taught. I never saw the teacher. The consciousness that I was engaging never took any physical or visual form, but I always felt myself engaging a hyper-consciousness that took me on a systematic course of instruction over many years. And so it showed me a lot. It taught me a lot about how certain things work. And one of the things it taught me was how reincarnation works, what the trajectory of reincarnation is. Once I began to drop my earlier assumptions of the up and out cosmology, once I began to take in these new ideas and to roll them around in my mind, a lot of things began to make sense. The pieces that we know of reality began to fit together in a more satisfying way. So it began to make more sense to me, given that the universe is going to be here for billions and billions and billions of years more, to begin to understand that we're not at the peak of our evolutionary development. It could well be that we're just getting started. We're just babies. After billions of years of evolution and hundreds of thousands of years, 100,000 years after we got our 50% bigger mind, a bigger brain, about 5,000 years after we just began to have contact with that dimension of consciousness, which is a universal, which we share with all other living beings, humans and other living beings. After several thousand years of writing, we're just beginning to wake up. We're just beginning to understand who and what we are. We're just beginning to understand that the essence of our life is indestructible, cannot die. Energy can be rearranged, but the essence of it cannot be extinguished. Imagine if we were really just in the first act of a 10-act play.
Yeah.
And everything that we've accomplished up to now is just getting us started.
Yeah.
And the question is...
I'm sorry, please go ahead.
What are you going to do with your next million years?
Exactly.
It's
I think, it's so important to look at it not only in the big picture, but in the huge, infinite picture.
Yes.
It seems like what accompanies course existence, though, sometimes is a veil that so easily can be put over us that sort of tricks us, or many, maybe this is more in contemporary society, but tricks us into thinking that this is all that there is. Like you see that with scientism, sort of the religion of science, how it's saying, if you can't weigh it, measure it, touch it, it's not there. Did we just take a step back before a leap forward, do you think, or?
Well, of course, science is the great accomplishment of the modern era. If you haven't fallen in love with science, you just missed one of the great romances with the greatest intellectual developments of our species in, just eons. But science was so eager in it divorcing itself, separating itself from the theological traditions of Europe and the limitations and the frustrations and of those traditions, that they bought into a metaphysical system. They merged the scientific method with materialism, with the view that matter is the only reality. Now, in fact, I think today the best scientists are already deconstructing that naive materialism. The physicists are they're talking about how many dimensions of existence there are. We've already got dark matter and dark energy, and we're beginning to deconstruct that materialism. But scientism is still the most powerful philosophy, the most powerful religion in our universities. And it is a belief that matter is the only thing that exists. So I think psychedelics are very, very helpful in helping us shatter that belief, because it doesn't take many experiences to shatter the belief that matter is the only thing that exists. You can have experiential access to this other dimension. You can either meditate for many decades and enter into conscious rapport, or you can spend one weekend a month for 12 months in 1 year, go through a very, very intense regimen, and break through the limits of your physical consciousness and experience for yourself that your mind is larger than your body. It's older and larger than your body. So I think that has an important philosophical impact. I'd love for us to take the best scientists in the world, the PhDs from the best disciplines, and put them through 100 of them, put them through a psychedelic regimen for 1 year, and then to harvest the insights that those men and women would come back with. That's where we're going. Psychedelics are a true philosophical revolution.
Absolutely, and they're becoming more acceptable. There's almost a new renaissance, psychedelic renaissance happening.
There sure is. Yeah, there really
amazing.
is. It's starting with therapy. Right? Mm-hmm. It's starting with the healing potential of psychedelics, which means the gentler psychedelics, psilocybin, MDMA, and lower doses. But it's only a matter of time as we establish more credibility, establishing the therapeutic potential that comes from these amplifying substances, that we will rediscover what the best researchers discovered decades ago, that they have the capacity to initiate us into a deeper experience of the universe itself. So we'll go underneath the personal unconscious, underneath the healing, into philosophical exploration, cosmological exploration.
Yeah, that's exciting to contemplate, for sure.
Mm.
So I noticed throughout the book several times the importance of the cycle of death and rebirth, sort of like the wheel of Dharma. Do you think that this is something that is sort of a launching point, or is that a wheel that we remain on for lack of a better concept, eternity, but we ride it in a different way the more aware we become?
Well, the wheel of samsara is this early understanding, early breakthrough, that everything in physical reality is temporary and everything moves in cycles. There's a cycle of death and rebirth taking place constantly. Mountains rise and fall. Ecosystems rise and fall. Planets, star systems, everything is constantly moving. Everything is constantly changing. The early vision was that reincarnation had this perpetual process about it, that we were just trapped in time. We were trapped in our reincarnational series. I think what the cycle of death and rebirth that takes place in a psychedelic session is different than this. Just as in meditation practice, you go through a process in which you interrupt the cycle of karma. You exhaust your karma. You enter into states of consciousness which are truly non-karmic. You're entering into a deeper intimacy with the fundamental ground of existence. And when you touch into that fundamental ground, you touch into a reality which neither begins nor ends. It's not causal. It's different than causal reality. Psychedelic work, when it's approached systematically, therapeutically, and with clear spiritual intent, you go through a similar process. You go through a succession of death and rebirth processes. And the reason is simply, you can't take the ego into deep non-ordinary states and give the ego an experience of reality as it functions in those states. The only way you can really experience these deeper states of consciousness is to literally become a citizen of those states of consciousness. You literally must become the consciousness itself. So when you have an experience of the collective psyche, you don't take Chris Bache's ego and give Chris Bache an experience of the collective psyche. You literally have to become, for hours at a time, some dimension of the collective psyche, or some dimension of archetypal reality, or some dimension of the divine consciousness. So you literally, in order to experience things which are that big, that powerful, that old, your time-space consciousness has to be shattered to allow your consciousness to flow into these larger, more encompassing fields. And because the universe has many layers to it, because there are many degrees of depth to the universe, the first death, ego death, which is the death of your time-space identity, is followed by other deaths that take place at deeper and deeper levels of reality. So my sense is that death and rebirth is simply the cycle of purification that allows you to enter into deeper intimacy with different levels of transcendent reality. So there's a going out and there's a coming in. Now what you are entering into, well, that's where the challenge of description begins. What are you entering into? You're entering into the bowels of existence. You're entering into the fabric of the consciousness, which is the consciousness behind and saturating all time and space. You're entering into the night sky that you see behind my head, this vast world of levels and levels and levels of intelligence there. I mean, no one person can explore it all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And do you think that the one of the functions of a high dose of LSD like that is, you talked about shattering all of those sort of egoic attachments. It wasn't like you were at a metaphorical intersection and then you chose, okay, let's go shatter those. The high dosage of LSD sort of did that, sort of tugged you there. Well, I won't say against your will because you took it willingly, but it gave you no choice, right? Well, you can always run from it. And once it gets started, you can run from it. That's a dumb thing to do, because that's when the pain begins. But basically, it does shatter you. And I had no control over what happened in my sessions except my choice to engage consciously and to surrender completely to what happened. So if you create the conditions that are optimal for undergoing a true transformative experience, which are isolation, protection, surrender, and safety, and amplification. Amplify your consciousness with these powerful psychedelics, which is what they're just amplifiers. They are catalysts. Intensify your experience with carefully selected music to really help you surrender to that process. Let the process take you wherever it will take you. It does. Basically what we're finding is it just shatters you. The mind, your egoic consciousness is just not that difficult to take apart. We have a highly overrated sense of how complex our minds are. Well, they're just not that complicated. You can shatter them, and when you shatter them, you dissolve for a few hours into some level of reality outside of your personal existence. Then your mind comes back again. And then a few months later, when you're ready, you do the same process. You just dissolve into some deeper fabric of existence. And then you come back down again. If you keep that up systematically and rhythmically, of course you can imagine it's really important to consolidate well. It's really important to be healthy, to really pay a lot of attention to all the different physical and psychological and emotional systems that you're part of, and your social systems. But if you keep this rhythm up, you can go deeper and deeper into the universe, far, far beyond anything to do with your personal unconscious. After about the first dozen or so sessions, when I was in the peak hours of work, I was operating far beyond
my personal consciousness for the most part.
I found it very interesting that you used music because it seems like to me that would act as a sort of a tether to the tangible world. Sort of like, oh, you mentioned Willie Nelson. Oh, here's the Willie Nelson song. I remember hearing that when, and then you would just sort of get lost in the chain of thought that could that have that effect on you?
Yeah. Well, I only use Willie Nelson to stay relaxed while the LSD was beginning to build in my body and kick in. When it began to kick in, Willie went away, and then there are certain criteria that you use in the music you select. So you do not want to use any familiar music. You don't want to use music that you know. You don't want to use any music that's in English, if I'm in English, that has words that I can understand, because I don't want their thoughts seeding my experience.
Gotcha.
I very quickly discovered that indigenous music was more evocative for me than Western classical music. So I developed a library of music that I would use, which was strongly indigenous, that was strongly spiritual, that did not have any music, any refrains that I could relate to. It was instrumental for the most part, or it was chanting in language that I did not know. And the purpose of the music is to basically, well, of course, there's stages of a session, okay? So there's certain types of music you want when you're building energy, certain types of music that you want when you're at breakthrough, and then certain types of music you want after breakthrough when you're in the long, open, spacious places. And then you want different types of music for the slow return. So there's papers that have been written on this, kind of pacing the music to the rhythm of the session. You don't want music to guide you. You don't want music to steer you. But music can basically help you surrender to the upwelling of consciousness that's pouring into you from underneath.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And you mentioned the Bulgarian Voices, which I think, I love that album. If it says The Mystery of the Bulgarian Voices, is that the one? Oh, yeah, it's so beautiful.
Yeah. The Mysterious Voices of Bulgaria. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, amazing. Yeah. Amazing choice. Well, a lot of these experiences also too were, many would describe as sort of hellish or nightmarish. But you obviously you pass through those. Do you think that there's something to be said about having to go through hell before you reach heaven? I mean, is there some necessary process in sort of having to crawl through the shards of your shattered self in order to break through past that?
That's a complicated question. I don't think there are many rules for these type of things. We have a lot of theological interpretations. You got to go through hell to get to heaven and things like this. Well, it doesn't always work. Teresa of Avila was a great 16th century Catholic mystic. Her dark night of the soul lasted decades before she reached full realization. Meanwhile, Teresa of Lisieux came along, and 16 years old, she just popped into fully illumined unitive consciousness. So, there's just different rhythms here, but basically, to me, it was a major concern I had when I wrote the book, and I talk about it in the methodology chapter. The primary concern I had was exposing the reader to as much suffering as is in this journey, and there's a lot of it. And it's important to understand what this suffering is involved. It's not easy to let go of your identity and to allow yourself to die as the person you've always known yourself to be. That takes time. So part of it is the fear that comes with letting go of the familiar and opening up to what is unfamiliar. And then, of course, this repeats itself. Once you stabilize and become familiar at a certain level of spiritual reality, then if you're being invited to go into a deeper level where you don't know the rules, and it operates completely differently, and you can't be the same person that you were in this first level at the second level, then you have to go through this fear of surrender and this deconstruction. But it's not just that. Every level deeper into a deeper state of consciousness is an entry into a higher level of energy. Deeper levels of consciousness function at higher levels of energy. Also, deeper levels of consciousness are purer than lower levels of consciousness. And when you begin to have access to very, very pure, crystalline, celestial sort of states of consciousness, it triggers a profound detoxification process where you're purging enormous toxicities out of your psychophysical system. And that's hard work. I mean, it's basically every spiritual tradition knows that purification is essential to spiritual realization. What happens in the LSD process is, if you use it conscientiously, is you accelerate that purification process, you deepen it. There's no shortcuts in this game, but you can go faster, but if you go faster, you have to go through this purifications more intensely. And it gets complicated when the purification is taking place in ways that you don't understand, because it's completely beyond anything that you know or may know from time-space reality. But always, if you engage those difficult periods of suffering, if you let them take you where they want to take you, carry them all the way through to the end. My experience has been, and many people's experience has been, you will reach a breaking point. You will reach a critical breakthrough where you will go through some type of profound surrender or loss or death. And then you will transition into an ecstatic reality. You will experience peace, and then resolution, and then profound peace, and then ecstatic teaching. So what you internalize, what you take back from the experience, is not just the pain and suffering, but the pain and suffering goes to breakthrough, which goes to peace and ecstatic teaching. So you internalize the entire cycle. So I don't have any trouble with any of the pain and suffering that I experience. I don't have flashbacks. I can listen to the music that I listen to in this painful part. Doesn't bother me at all, because once you learn the cycle, once you know the cycle and experience it many times, then you just understand that that's just how it works.
Did you
In
ever?
fact, you can even suffering becomes your friend, your ally. Death becomes your ally, because the greatest ecstatic illuminations follow the deepest deaths. At that point, when you really understand that, then the purification unto death is something that you actually embrace, not run away from.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of death and rebirth and suffering and bliss, did you ever get to a point where you transcended the duality, where they were all part of the same?
Oh, yeah. One of the joys of this work is leaving behind all our foolish separations. And that is such a constant theme in our mystical traditions and our spiritual traditions, entering into non-duality, entering into different domains of oneness, entering into the primal void that's prior to all physical differentiation. What the Buddhists call shunyata, emptiness of self. When you experience radical emptiness, to experience the world as one, even though it's moving in all of its parts, but to experience that the world is a single organism, that there is no separate self in me, there is no separate self in anything around me. We are not fundamentally separate entities. We are organic expressions of a living, total unified consciousness. When that happens, and you surrender to that reality, those are some of the great deep joys, because it's like really waking up and realizing, that's what it's been all the way along. In fact, I thought I was a separate part, but I was never a separate part. This is the way it's always been. There's always been this unified life that's pulsating through us. So naturally, when you wake up to that, compassion spontaneously flows out of you, because why would you ever want to hurt someone when at a deeper level, you know that being is another aspect of you, or you are another aspect with that being of a larger totality.
Exactly.
So, you kind of relax. You relax. You don't take yourself so seriously. You kind of, your projects change. Service becomes more natural. Compassion becomes more spontaneous. And then what you want above all else is not to nurture your separate self, but to return more deeply into the unitive self, into the divine self, into the, call it what you want to call it. Find a secular vocabulary, find a spiritual vocabulary. But those hours spent in those conditions are hours of deep, deep joy,
Do you think that duality is sort of a bad habit that we pick up from coarse physical reality? Because it's easy to just divide things up into bad or good, or black or white, or do you think that's a symptom of physical existence, or does that exist even outside of the physical realm?
Well, it's a characteristic of physical existence. It's a symptom of physical existence. It's perfectly understandable. It comes with the territory. When you enter into time and space, you are one among many. So, but it is also characteristics of certain levels of spiritual existence. When you enter spiritual reality, that sense of being one among many doesn't disappear completely. It falls away gradually. Of course, there are many beings through history who have shown us that you can be inside time and space, and you can let go of that sense of being one among many. All our great spiritual teachers have done that. They talk about the family of humanity. They talk about the inclusiveness of Sangha, of community. So we know that it's not inherent in time and space. There's nothing necessary about being divided by simply being inside time and space, but we also know it's what trips a lot of us up. We get caught inside our private skin, and then we keep trying to take care of ourselves, and that sets up the endless struggles of duality. Either thinking we're not enough and we need more, or thinking, we want to push things away because they threaten us. But when you begin to let go of that, when that begins to exhaust itself and you move into those deeper conditions, then you move into states of awareness where you realize that this state of awareness is completely compatible with having a separate body. It's completely compatible with being a separate being, but at another level, you're not a separate being. Your mind is not contained in your skull. Your heart is part of a field of consciousness that taps right into the universe itself. That consciousness is a field, and the greater the identity, truly, the more open the field, the larger the field, so that collaboration becomes increasingly natural, right? That competition and aggression is a symptom of spiritual childhood. Mm-hmm. When we mature,
thinking that you're a separate entity and that you're looking out for number one. You're
looking out for number one.
Yeah, exactly. When number one is everything, and that's what brings unhappiness. That's a kind of a suffering in and of itself, is thinking that we're separate from one another.
Yeah, and that's why all spiritual teachings teach us first, practice compassion, let go of your selfishness, cultivate generosity, cultivate compassion. And the more you do that, it begins to open you to the fact of that level of reality where we are not separate, where we truly are one. We practice compassion to enter into conscious awareness of oneness, conscious oneness.
Well, what is you mentioned something in your book called the Perinatal Domain. Could you describe what that is?
Well, this was one of Stan Grof's early and very important discoveries. When you are in the early stages of work and you are in the process of dismantling your time-space consciousness, and there's a sense he describes 3 levels of consciousness: the psychodynamic level, which is your personal unconscious, your personal history, the personal dynamics. And then at the 3rd level is transpersonal consciousness, where you're into transpersonal states of consciousness. But the boundary is what he calls the perinatal. And it is the transition beyond individual consciousness, time-space consciousness, into spiritual consciousness. And I think of it as kind of transcending the boundary of birth and death. In order to open up to deeper levels of reality, you must let go of you must allow your physical consciousness to no longer be the container of your consciousness. So you basically have to transcend the limits of physical existence. Now, we get here by being born, and we leave by dying. And so death and birth are like a revolving door between spiritual reality and physical reality. And it turns out that the mind stores the experience of dying and the experience of being born into these very tight clusters within the deep unconscious. So when people begin to push literally past the boundaries of death, they often, the physical limits of their physical body, they often experience all sorts of fears and terrors related to death, and they sometimes experience times when they've died in previous lives. But they also experience often their birth, their physical rebirth. They relive their being born. It's very confusing how you can be experiencing dying and being born at the same time. But then when you begin to understand that they're a revolving door, and you're working through this process, eventually you come to a point where being born is hard work. It often encodes a certain level of trauma in the system. But by reliving your entire birth, you can exhaust that imprint. And there reaches a point where, when you make the transition, he called this the perinatal level of consciousness because of this peculiar fetal birth quality to going through this level. But eventually, one goes through this level. And it's classically when you complete this transition, your ego dies. It just dies. People experience ego death in all sorts of different ways. And you go through the perinatal level of consciousness. The cycle of death and rebirth will continue at later levels, but it's not going to continue in the same way that it continued in the first level. The first transition is a transition out of time and space into spiritual reality. And this takes place in this complex domain that he calls the perinatal level of consciousness. So it's the basement of the personal unconscious, and it's the doorway to spiritual consciousness.
That makes total sense. Absolutely. Something else that you talk about is different sorts of time. Speaking of time and space, you mentioned something called whole time, and you mentioned something called deep time.
Yeah.
Maybe could you summarize what those are, if that's possible?
Well, when I went through ego death, and I continued to move into deeper states of consciousness, I entered a domain that I call the ocean of suffering. I began to open up into vast, what the Buddhists would call the hell realms, vast ocean of terrible pain and suffering. But when I was spun through that, when I went through that, and that was a very consistent process, it took 2 years. But in the first year when I went through this, I entered an extraordinary state of consciousness that literally took me many sessions to learn how to remember, learn how to stabilize consciousness there. I experienced consistently for 7 consecutive sessions, I experienced my entire life from birth to death as a simultaneous now. And I experienced all the moments of my life as simultaneously present. Now, of course, we'd say, that's impossible. Of course, that's impossible inside linear time but in this state of consciousness, I experienced not some kind of abstract projection of my old age. I experienced the distilled residue of what I had become over the course of my entire life. All of my life's time moments were present. And I came to call this whole time. And then eventually I came to call it deep time. So for those 7 sessions, I experienced the entirety of my life and had deep, deep insights given me about the purpose of my life, the project of my life, the relationships that I was part of, so on and so forth. Later, when I went deeper still, I began to have deeper experiences of deep time that went far beyond my personal life. I entered into the life of the species. I entered into our evolutionary story, our evolutionary destiny. And time became very porous for me. So eventually I was forced to conclude that there are actually different modalities of time operant in the universe. That within linear time, time is linear. Within space and time, time is linear. But as you go to the edges of space, you also go to the edges of time. And if there are 11 or 13 dimensions of existence, as string theory is proposing, some of the qualities of those dimensions or alternative levels of reality involve different modalities of time. I've just experientially, I don't argue this on scientific grounds, even though scientists talk about particles that travel backwards in time, tachyons, and they talk about what happens to time at the center under the compression of black holes. They talk about a variety of ways in which time is anomalous to linear time. But experientially, I'm convinced that there are different modalities of time in the universe. And if you enter deep into the mind of the universe, you enter into different temporal realities. And so that what sounds completely fanciful to be able to know the future from within inside time and space, and that is fanciful. I mean, I understand that. But when consciousness goes beyond time and space, a deeper horizon of time opens. So a lot of my experiences involved not my life trajectory, but the trajectory of our species, the trajectory of humanity on this planet, which I knew it both not simply as Chris Bache, but I knew it by being dissolved into the mind of the species. And I knew it not by staying in the present and looking toward a distant future, but by literally transcending the limits of time that gave me a first-hand encounter with what our species had become in the future, what it was in the process of becoming, and what would be necessary for it to get where it was in the process of becoming. Now, I know that sounds outrageous, and I apologize to my scientific colleagues for that, but that's just what it was.
Sure, yeah. Well, you're speaking from your experiential subjectiveness, although it sounds like you went way beyond yourself and objectively experienced a lot of truths. It's almost like an experiential philosophy that you spent a lot of time immersing yourself in. Like, it's mind-blowing. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
It is exactly that. I mean, basically what we're looking at, I think, is a new way of doing philosophy. It has 3 parts. You systematically expand your state of consciousness for hours at a time. Then you come back, and the second step is you make a detailed record of what happened. And third, you analyze what happened. You integrate it or bring it into juxtaposition with other bodies of knowledge, other bodies of scientific knowledge, and you compare it to the experiences of other people who have followed similar protocols. And by this systematic opening as cleanly and clearly as you can, and then coming back and analyzing it carefully, and not keeping it private, making it a collective discussion, as all good research does. So you have all the elements: critical self-awareness, conscientious methodology, and collective enterprise to balance out the checks and balances of idiosyncrasies. I think we're looking at a new philosophy. This is a philosophy that was articulated by William James. Now, of course, it's not an entirely new philosophy. The Eleusinian mysteries had it. The ayahuasca traditions of Brazil have it. The Native American peyote and mushroom traditions had it. We're simply seeing it arise within a particularly modern, particularly highly educated environment. But the method is ancient. So I think what we're finding is here we have a new way of engaging the fundamental questions about, is there a meaning to existence? Is there an intelligence to the order of our lives? Is there a purpose to the project of existence? How does life work? So classically, within a materialistic philosophy, we would say we can't know these things. These are purely fanciful speculations. But with a psychedelic methodology, we have the opportunity to critically, repeatedly enter into these states where we can have these insights. And what do you know? It turns out that the insights are fundamentally congruent with the deepest insights of the deepest mystical traditions of history.
And I think that's a convenient shortcut for a lot of people in our culture too, because if we're not a part of some mystery school or some long lineage of, deep meditation, or some other practice that could take us into those realms too, what we have conveniently is something like psychedelics that can just usher us there almost immediately, and without any sort of having to answer a set of questions or anything like that. You're just there. It transports you there immediately.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful because there are many levels to there.
Absolutely.
And I think the early idea that psychedelics give us easy access, this is one of the early criticisms of psychedelics among scholars. It seemed like a shortcut to spiritual awakening. And my concern is just the opposite. When you use these substances in a therapeutic modality, my concern is that it can accelerate the initiation so intensely that it can basically take you too far too fast. Mm-hmm. And you have to go through a very, very painful purification process in order to meet those. Now, if you just want to loosen the boundaries of your mind and you want to, you can open up with some moderate doses of psilocybin or LSD or something like this, and you can perceive and participate in the inclusive embrace of the universe. You can touch those dimensions. You certainly can. And you can really you can touch them. And even touching them temporarily can have deep effects, deep transformative effects on your lives. I think that's why mushrooms heal, because they connect us to these deeper levels of consciousness, which heals the wounds that we've collected in life along the way. And that is a great good. But if you want to go deeper into intimacy with the divine, or with this divine consciousness, then there is no shortcut. You engage and it works you over.
Yes, I wasn't trying. I guess I should have stated it more clearly. Not a shortcut to enlightenment, but a shortcut to these dimensions and realms of reality where that potential is a possibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, of course, you have to do a lot of work once you're there too, but it doesn't do it for you.
Yeah, and it's confusing. I mean, I was fortunate in that I had a lot of study of mystical traditions and spiritual, cross-cultural spiritual traditions. And it's not that those traditions guided me to where I went, because I had many experiences that were not covered or touched by any of those traditions, but they did help me understand what I was engaging retroactively.
And you said you were a practicing Buddhist. Did that work well with interweaving with the work that you were doing with psychedelics?
There have been two religious traditions that have had the greatest influence on me. One was Christianity. I was raised in a Christian tradition. I actually was studying to be a priest way back when. And the other one is Buddhism. Now, I've studied all the religions of the world. I've taught world religions. I've taught comparative mysticism for many years. And I've learned so much from all of the religions. I really love Taoism. I love Hinduism. The religions of the world have been like girlfriends, women I've loved. I wouldn't want to give up any of them.
Sure.
But I practice pretty consistently these days in Buddhism. There are certain advantages to it, but I practice it not as a conventional Buddhist. I practice it kind of as a universalist who happens to be performing the traditions of Buddhism. Mm-hmm. I find them to be very compatible. But I do think that the world that psychedelics can open us into ultimately is a larger world than any of the historical religions. Any of the historical religions have basically captured. Now, let me back up. Individual great beings have arisen in different historical traditions, religious traditions, spiritual traditions around the world, and great beings are to be honored. I honor all of them, wonderful beings. And at the same time, there is a depth of exposure that can happen in a sustained psychedelic inquiry, which seems to drive, it drives either beyond these traditions, or it drives you as far into the universe as some of the great beings have gone. Now, great beings can live there. With psychedelics, you don't get to live there. You only get to visit there. And that we have to remember that constantly. That's not the same. To have a profound mystical experience with psychedelics is not the same as having a profound mystical experience just using the natural power of your own consciousness. But a temporary experience, a profoundly true temporary experience, is life-changing. Now, what I mean is, when I say it pushes the boundaries, I don't think the religions of the world have paid a lot of attention to the transformation of the species as a whole. They have generally thought of the species as a whole as being too large and irredeemable a project, and they have focused on transforming individuals within the species. But they haven't really explored the question, where is humanity as a whole going? And at least it's been a part of my psychedelic journey that was one of the dominant themes that the universe kept wanting me to come back to. So much so that it just became clear that the universe was engaged in a project that was about the transformation of the entire human species. And in a sense, all of our individual transformations are part of a collective transformation. And the universe doesn't think small. The universe thinks in terms of wanting to transform the entire species. And we are privileged to be part of that process, so that our transformation is part of its transformation. Our sins are its sins. Our breakthroughs are its breakthroughs. But grace covers the entire species. Psychedelics have taken me deep into the story of humanity's collective transformation. So much so that my individual awakening or my individual transformation became practically irrelevant to me compared to the larger story of our collective initiation.
And you also mentioned something called collective reincarnation.
Yeah.
Describe what that is.
Well, when I wrote my book, Life Cycles on Reincarnation, I was still thinking within traditional terms. It's a book which begins by looking at the scientific evidence for reincarnation. And so that's the modern part of it. But the story that I was telling there is basically the story of reincarnation and karma. It's the story of the individual becoming spiritually developed through cause and effect, becoming more conscious, more aware, more discriminating in their choices, and undergoing a developmental process that takes place over many, many lifetimes. I began to have experiences when I was working through the subtle level of consciousness, at the deeper architecture of consciousness. I began to have experiences of experiencing the entire human species, incarnating, reincarnating every 100 years, just say, the entire species pulsing, coming back, and I was immersed in the intelligence that was guiding or orchestrating or being the incarnation of this species as it incarnated again and again. And I began to realize that thinking small in terms of the individual, the evolution of the individual, is simply a habit of thinking in an atomistic Newtonian kind of spiritual world. When nature, it's not that the individual evolution is not true. It is true, just like atoms are true. But deeper than atoms, there's a quantum reality. And deeper than individual evolution, reincarnation, there's a species reincarnation taking place. And one doesn't negate the other. They are simultaneous truths. So there is an intelligence expressing itself in the species and an intelligence expressing itself in the individual. And they're complexly intertwined. So once you experience that, once you experience the entire planet engaged in a conscious, collective, evolutionary thrust, then you step back and you think, whoa, it's not simply individuals. There's a much deeper dynamic driving evolution here.
Yeah, so much of this book is so big picture, and that's what I really appreciate about it, is it zooms away from where we usually sit inside of our little human suits, and not only goes above the planet, but goes above the universes, the multiverse, which has always been a perspective that I've been compelled by. When I was a kid, I remember thinking, I didn't really buy my parents' concept of God, but I would think a thought exercise would be, okay, so there's a God. Well, where did God just sprout out of nowhere? Something made God. Well, then what made that? And then that would just go into infinity. And then I would realize in the most mind-melting way that we're so tiny and time is so infinitesimal that it's just it's hard to wrap your everyday mind around.
Yeah, it is hard to wrap our everyday mind around. And people who spend their life looking through telescopes into the nebula and the galaxies that mark the universe, they live in a large mental world. And people who study the processes of the creation of star systems within galaxies, they live in this very, very large world. Well, that's all truly noble. And people who really understand plate tectonics or understand the DNA of evolution, those are profoundly large projects. This is simply another variation of that same process, except we're now taking a bite out of the apple of mind. We're taking a bite out of the consciousness of the universe. Classically, we were taught the universe doesn't have a mind. The universe isn't a mind. The universe is a machine. It's a mechanical process. It moves with mathematical machine precision. Well, now we're beginning to understand that's just a mythology. That's just an unexamined mythology. If you push deep within your own mind, you find that your own mind doesn't have a bottom. It doesn't have a basement. You drop right through your mind into deeper levels of consciousness, which are collective in the species. And you can drop deeper still through the bottom of the species mind into still deeper and deeper levels of consciousness, until eventually it just becomes unmistakable that you have entered the ocean of consciousness, a vast ocean. Now, that doesn't mean you instantaneously know everything that there is to know, but if you engage that consciousness conscientiously, that vast consciousness will take you in and it'll teach you. It'll literally teach you. And when I say teach you, I mean it'll make sure in order to make sure you understand what it has shown you, what it has taken, it'll take you back again and again and again until it's sure that you've got it. And then later, the next session, you'll come back and it'll take you farther. So you're systematically, little mind is exploring big mind. The mind, you're using mind to explore mind. But the mind which you're exploring is not simply some canyon of your personal unconscious. And it's not even some canyon of the collective unconscious. If you go deep enough, you're exploring the mind of the universe, some aspect of the mind of the universe.
Have your experiences, all of these experiences, led you to believe that personal transformation and universal transformation are inextricably connected?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, just as reincarnation is a higher octave of evolution. Evolution falls collective learning forward. Reincarnation falls individual learning forward. Evolution evolves whole species. Individuals evolve individuals within the species, but not just that. If all the individuals within the human family are evolving, then the human family itself is evolving. It's participating in the constant unfolding of greater and greater complexity, just as our universe is unfolding around us. Everywhere we're seeing greater and greater complexity. So that's always been the great sadness, that the more deeply we have seen the beauty of the universe, when we've gone back to our own individual lives and we're told, you're here by random chance, there's no purpose to your life, there's no meaning to your life, and by the way, when you die, you simply cease to exist. So you can do good or you can do evil, but it doesn't amount to anything. So that means we actually don't get to participate in the meaning and the beauty and the grandeur that we're surrounded by. But when you go deep within your consciousness and you discover the deeper patterns of your own mind and the way in which we are embedded in these larger cosmic patterns of mind, then the beauty of the galaxies, the beauty of your life becomes proportionate, in a sense, to the beauty of the galaxies. And it's not because you're projecting, and it's not because you have your fear of death. Fear of death vanishes in this. I mean, one of the nice things about this work is I have absolutely no fear about dying. I mean, honestly, I'm looking forward to it because I've been there. I know what's waiting for me when I die. So it's just, what is there to fear?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's I think what materialism, that's the fear that breeds people who believe in materialism, in the sense that they, this is you only get one chance, you only got one life,
Yeah.
so that either can make one be very hedonistic, or make one, I don't know, it takes the focus off of the bigger picture and makes it much more myopic.
Yeah. And, I understand that philosophy. I really do. I mean, I've taught at a university, and that is the religion of the universities, American education. Most of my good friends in my department, people I really worked with and loved deeply, they were atheist materialists. And I understand how we got there. I understand the deep convictions that led them to this position. But I also have seen what a corrosive influence it is on the lives of our students. It undermines their vitality. It undermines their belief that there is something intelligent, worthwhile engaging, that the universe is truly alive, and you can embrace that aliveness. Now, my students don't want to go back to plenary indulgences, and they don't want to go back to old ways of religion. They want to go forward. They want to go into a scientific and then post-scientific, sophisticated embrace of the study of consciousness and the world that we can go there. And in this world, you don't reject science. You simply reject the metaphysics of materialism, which science was born into in the 18th century, and now in the 21st century is in the process of being born out of.
Yeah.
We're moving into a post-materialist science.
I think it's easy sometimes, at least for me, to mix up the science itself with the way that science is applied. You know, you see it applied in laboratories that are sponsored by corporations who are banking on a particular outcome to happen. But that isn't all of science. Science is a discipline that is supposed to be about question asking and exploration and expanding our knowledge of the universe. So yes, I have to remind myself of that sometimes.
Yeah.
So maybe this will be the last question, since we're rounding on an hour and a half, which is how long we decided to talk, and I barely touched my list of questions. We might have to have a part two.
Might have to have a part two.
Or a part 20. No, I'm just kidding. Because we, as minuscule as our tiny little sliver of our universe that we occupy is, it still is important. And so because of that interconnectedness that we talked about and the collaborative nature of reality, it places a sort of responsibility upon us to be as conscious and awake and present in our self, however we define that, as we can possibly be, in order to maybe incur harmony or incur a better universe, a more positive universe for everybody to exist in. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. In Vedanta and other non-dual traditions, there's been a history in which we basically say individuality is an illusion. In the end, the individual dissolves and returns to the one, like a drop returns in the ocean. The drop dissolves and completely disappears into the ocean. And that was held as kind of the ultimate trajectory of a spiritually realized life, is to extinguish individuality, extinguish that individual life. And that's not my belief system, and that's not what I've seen and experienced in my psychedelic sessions. I think individuality is one of the precious gifts that the universe has given us. Now, in our innermost essence, in our heart of hearts, the life that we live is the life of the divine. It is the life of the universe. So the essence of me and the essence of you and the essence of everyone around us, it is the essence of the totality. We are kind of a ray of light from the universal sun. So our indestructible nature, our essential nature, is this universal vast nature. But my light has been like growing and growing and growing for thousands of years, as your light has been growing and growing for thousands of years. And the individual grain of our life, the individual nuance and flavor and structure of our life, is one of the great gifts of the universe. There seem to me to be two fundamentally deep truths in life. One is the truth of oneness. Right? That's a great, great truth.
Absolutely.
The other truth is the truth of individuality, that we are true individuals. Now, you put those together, and you have a metaphysical system where we are of the one, we are growing within the one, and yet we are individuals exploring our own creativity and our own self-emergent quality. And we can create, we can control our destiny within this oneness, universe of oneness. That individuality is not extinguished when we die, and it's not extinguished when we become awakened. It's not extinguished when we reach full spiritual realization. I think that that individuality, that is, when, if you study beings who are really have a claim to be God-soaked, or beings who are truly, truly, immersed in divine consciousness or awakened consciousness, they are truly individuals. They are really very, very different from one another, and that those differences are to be celebrated. So there's nothing incompatible with being a complete individual and being soaked in the reality of oneness. So my sense is that when a true individual matures enough that they wake up to the reality of oneness, and they wake up to that reality which is where they are one within themselves with the oneness, and they begin to understand that everybody else is a manifestation within that oneness, a fractal embodiment of oneness, then naturally they move into greater harmony. Naturally they move into deeper peace within themselves and within society. And they become more creative because their individual genius becomes more permeable to the genius of the universe. And they can take in knowing, they can take in information from levels of consciousness that they previously couldn't take it in from. So they become not only more harmonious within their social life and harmonious within their individual life, but they become more enlivened, more creative, more intelligent, literally, greater mathematicians, greater artists. And it's going to keep going for millions and billions of more years. Just imagine what we'll be in 1,000,000 years from now. Now we're coming into hard times, right? We're coming into rising oceans, catastrophic consequences of our industrial era and our psychological isolation. Some people think we're going extinct, and we certainly are going to be coming close to extinct. What has emerged in my visions and my psychedelic sessions is we are not going extinct, we are growing up. We are coming into an absolute watershed, a tipping point, a bifurcation point in our evolution. We have to grow up or we're going to die. And growing up in this context means coming to a spiritual awareness where we outgrow the small identity of ego and we wake up into the deeper identity of soul, which is a spiritual identity, and we wake up in the company of other souls. A species which is living out of the identity of soul creates a different planetary civilization than a species which is still living within the small fractured identity of ego. Ego thinks differences of race are important, differences of culture and gender are important. Soul has transcended those differences. Soul embodies lifetimes of memories of having been all the races of the world, of having been all the genders of the world. The soul wakes up and lives in the world differently than the ego does. Now, what would a planet of Earth, of beings living out of a soul consciousness, what could they create? Where would they be able to take this planet? That's where I think we're going. That's what's happening.
Amazing. You have such a great way of putting all of that. And it sounds very hopeful and an adventure that I'm glad that I'm a part of personally.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's really, this is a noble adventure.
Yes.
A noble adventure. Yeah.
Chris, thank you so much for mapping your experiences, not only because they're your own personal experiences, but because they're also a universal experience that we can all get something out of. And if you're up for it, maybe we can continue this conversation in the near future, because there's a few other things there's a few thousand other things, but I can limit it. Maybe we can have a part 2 sometime in the near future, maybe at the beginning of next year or something.
I'd be honored. It'd be a pleasure.
Fantastic. In the meantime, can you tell the listeners where they can find you and your work online?
Well, I'm not really very good at the PR side of this stuff.
Sure.
I'd like to do the work. My website is only now just being completed.
Oh, cool.
It basically will be, they can find me at chrisbache.com. My YSU, my university email address is cmbache@ysu.edu. But I'm transitioning from that to chris@chrisbache.com. And so there's a placeholder page on the web, and within a month or so, I hope it'll be fully active.
Fantastic. Maybe it'll be up and going by the next time that we talk.
It probably will. I hope
Cool.
so.
Fantastic. In the meantime, I'll put the links up in the episode notes, and people can go there and bookmark it for future reference.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
It's been a real pleasure, Chris.
Likewise. And I look forward to talking again, and have a good rest of your evening in the meantime.
Thank you. You too.
Wow. What a mind-melting conversation that was. That left me with the same sort of feeling that I used to get when I would listen to Terence McKenna tapes back in the 90s. And just the concepts that Terence would speak about would just sort of put me into a state of euphoria, just imagining the possibilities of the universe and exploring the universe and ways to do that. And it just, it would just put me into an altered state of mind. And that's exactly what this conversation with Chris did also. And perhaps it was because the subject matter was about altered states of mind and all the intense and wonderful and hellish places that they took Chris. But I found it very inspiring, and I felt like I was speaking with a true sage, somebody who literally traveled to other places and dimensions and times, and was able somehow to piece together enough of it to come back and tell the story. And for that, I'm highly appreciative. It was an extremely wonderful and intense book, absolutely intense. And I highly recommend it to anyone. There will be a link to it in the show notes. I do hope that you enjoyed this episode and you were able to glean something positive from it, that got your mind moving in a direction that is hopefully forward, or at least expansive. At least it made the space that you occupy feel much larger than it did before. And if you like that and you want to hear more, and by more, I don't mean like, if you want to keep hearing episodes, but if you want to hear more content, more episodes, an abundance, as opposed to one every 2 weeks, maybe at least one every week, if not more than that, there are ways that you can make that happen. And probably the most tangible way would be financially. To do that, you can go to www.patreon.com/themeltpodcast, and there you will find a way to contribute for anywhere from as small as $1 per month up. And that goes towards expanding, in the theme of this conversation, expanding the melt and what it is capable of doing. I would love to be able to devote much more time and energy on this. I feel like I just sort of have to fit it in with the more menial tasks of life sometimes. And by that, I just mean my work. I don't have a menial life by any means. I have a wonderful life. But I would love to devote much more time and energy to this podcast. I would love it to be my sole project. I think that I could really make something magnificent with it. And I've heard a lot of good feedback from some of the listeners, and I've started to get a good deal of Patreon support, which is fantastic, and I highly appreciate it. But there's definitely room for more. So you can go to my Patreon page to figure out how to do that. And other ways, if you don't have the finances, which I can absolutely relate to, other ways to do that would just be to share it, whether that be emailing a link to the site or a particular episode to a friend or a family member, posting it on whatever social media site that you frequent. And also going to where it is that you subscribe to this podcast and rating it, giving it a good rating or giving it a good review. All of that helps. And if none of those things are your bag, just sending good thoughts actually helps a lot. So at the bare minimum, I would definitely appreciate good vibes coming my way. It certainly can't hurt. Also, as you may, if you've listened to a good deal of Melt episodes, you may have noticed that before some of the main interviews, there are stories sent in by listeners, and I would love to have much, much more of those. They are stories of people talking about their firsthand experiences with some of the things that we talk about on the Melt. And and I would love to include more on future episodes. So if you have something that you would like to share, I would love to hear it. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. You can just record it on your phone and email it to themeltpodcast@protonmail.com. And if I can find an episode that is similar to your story, I will definitely put it up. So that is, I believe, all the housekeeping there is. I still have a Discord server that I am slowly working on trying to get up to par, get up to snuff. I would love that to be a place where people can go and talk about some of the stuff that we talk about on the Melt, and also hopefully to include some of the guests in some of those chats also. So there's a lot of potential there. I have yet to tap it. I'm totally open to any coaching in that regard. It's kind of intimidating. It seems like it holds a lot of potential, but I just haven't had the time to deep dive into it yet. But that definitely will happen. So as you may notice, I have a new logo and artwork, and soon the website will match that too. And I would like to thank Dominique Vallet for that, a fellow from Canada who sent me some examples of some of his work, and I was absolutely impressed. And so there you go. That is what the Melt looks like now. It's so close to what I pictured in my mind. And I would like to thank him for manifesting that for all to see. So soon there will be t-shirts and stickers and buttons and all that stuff that I will not only be using as premiums for Patreon supporters, but I will have some sort of a merch store on the website sometime, probably in 2021. Thank you all so much for listening. You're all so greatly appreciated. And if you have time to leave a rating or a good review or contribute $1, anywhere from $1 up per month, it would be greatly appreciated. Again, I have tons of great stuff coming up, and I will see you in 2 weeks. Thank you so much. Take care.